Good evening, everyone. I am Utkarsh, the coordinator for communication and events at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. On behalf of the foundation, I welcome you all to the second seminar of our Young Scholars Online Seminar Series 2024-25. This seminar is being presented by Anchal Kashyap. Please note that this session is being recorded and it will be made available on YouTube in the future. I invite Dr. Sandeepan Bakshi, director at the foundation, to speak a few words about the series and the foundation. Sandeepan, over to you.
Thank you, Utkarsh. And once again, hello and welcome to the FAS Young Scholars Online Seminar Series, the third round of the series. On behalf of FAS, let me once again warmly welcome you all to this second seminar of the seminar series by Anchal Kashyap, a doctoral student at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at the OP Jindal University. FAS, as many of you know, most of you know, I presume, is more than 2 decades old research organization based in Bengaluru, India. And we have been engaged with the study, we have been engaging with the study of rural India and rural economies in other parts of the developing world for a long span. One of our major, if I may say, almost a trademark, has been to work with young scholars working on rural India, whether it is in conducting research or planning for outreach activities. In fact, I am the one responsible for dragging the average age of the research team at FAS. And this seminar series is yet another testimony to our relationship, to our continuing relationship with young researchers. So I urge all young scholars out there who would like to associate with us to write to us, visit us whenever you happen to be in Bangalore. Have a look at our research resources. All of our research resources are open source, available on our website, fas.org.in. We also have a rolling internship program, of course, based on availability of projects. So you're most welcome to write to us on trying to, so we will try to work with you, collaborate in whichever capacity possible. Now, I'll not keep you waiting any longer. Just one last bit. As I was telling Anchal a minute ago, we are all looking forward to today's seminar on a topic that seems to bring together themes, themes such as penetration of capital in agriculture, an Himalayan state, and horticulture. I think we have had not the occasion of, to provide a platform to such a combination before. So really looking forward. In fact, this variety of topics is true for many of the planned seminars in this round of the series. We have thoroughly enjoyed reading the abstracts, and I'm sure that our audience would also equally find them enjoyable and insightful. Without further ado, let me call upon Professor Barbara Harris-White, a guide to the series, a constant companion, and the series chair. Professor Barbara, I request you to take over the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandeepan. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Good.
I can.
I should be brief. It's a real pleasure to chair these seminars from the foundation. And despite the fact that I drag the average age of people associated with FAS up by many decades, but I'm young in heart. And I'm sure there are other people who are also young in heart. We're all young scholars, really. I'm also very pleased that this series expands the concept of the agrarian to upstream and downstream of the production process itself, just as last year's expanded it to other South Asian countries. So without more ado, except for procedural, I would also repeat what Sandeepan has said, how welcome it is to have work on agribusiness, on input markets, on horticulture, and in Himachal. And I'm speaking from a part of France that is covered in plastic because it's producing apples under orchard conditions for mass markets. So I have a particular interest in the topic. The format is that you, Anchal, are very welcome to speak to up to about half an hour. And then Taniya Sah from Vidyashilp University will be the discussant who has experience in studying agricultural markets and value chains in Uttarakhand, so very useful experience. And you will be invited to speak to up to 10 minutes. And then we open it up to Q&A, which is mediated through the chat. So please put all your questions into the chat, and I will try to arrange them and bring it to some kind of order for discussion. Okay, without more ado, over to you, Anchal.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Shall I share my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for the introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm a third year PhD student. I've just done my data collection, and this is my second chapter of my thesis that I'll be presenting. And right, so capital penetration, I'll just get into it. Capital penetration, capital in general, I'll just give a very layman description. And it means investing in profits to expand wealth. It could be, and that profits come from your already means of production, which could be your land, which could be your existing machineries. In agriculture per se, it means using your financial and physical resources to make agriculture more production, to create agriculture production. And in this, the means of production, who owns the means of production also owns the sort of the way agriculture is shaped. And here, everything that has a life, it's commodified, which means it's something that is bought and sold in the market. So just that is what capital in general means. Right, as Professor was mentioning that Himalayas is a very interesting. So I'll just give a background of why Himachal per se. And in Himachal, I've chosen Shimla as my study area. So I'll just give a background of the agriculture production and the social organization of the village community in the region, just to give a background to where I'm going to come. So the agriculture in the Himalayas, because especially in Shimla district, because of the terrain, climate, everything, it has been very different from the rest of the district or even the country. Initially, it used to be very primitive in agriculture, only food grains like millets, like amaranth, bhatu, chalai, these kinds of sort of crops were produced with a little bit of animal husbandry. And it was only in the 1920s and later on in the 60s that we see that more of cash crops, particularly apples, that was brought in the 1960s. Before this, it was in 1920s when the cultivation of potatoes started with the development of roads and communication. It was only in the 20s when the Hindustan Tibet Road was formed and Shimla as a state was also consolidated. So hence we see that more means of communications being developed. So in the 1960s, we see that in the Shimla district, in the Kotgar region, which is one of the apple belt of the region, Emmanuel Stokes was one of the pioneers who started apple cultivation in the region. This is because this was primarily brought from the Western world. And here the production, because the climate was suitable, the soil was suitable, hence apple started to come in the region in the 1960s, and that's how it spread to the entire district. And from the 1960s, we see that there was a steady decline in the production of food grains, and apple sort of gradually took over the region. And here we see that it's now one of the main crops that the farmers produce for the market. It's one of the major economic sort of avenue for the government and for the people as well. So here I'm trying to understand that how in this particular PPT, I'll try to explain how the agrochemical industries, how the agrochemical sector, the capital, it has integrated into the production without directly being involved into the farming process. That is what the aim of the presentation is. Just a bit of social background. There were two communities. It has been very distinct that the low caste and the upper caste communities have been there. What I'm trying to show in this slide is trying to say is that because of there was one particular Bega duties that the agriculturalist or the agricultural labor had to perform for the feudal lords and additionally for the British that there was a system that sort of impacted the social hierarchy of the region. So because the landowning classes, they were able to produce two crops in a region. They were more they were more easily, they were able to provide malkanas or the revenues to the feudal lords, and the bega duties were rested upon the shoulders of those people essentially, who were not able to sort of give the revenues. And this bega duties can also be seen that the people were historically disadvantaged, and there were certain people in the region who took an upper hand in the region, and that's this system also changed the social hierarchy of the system. Right, so that's the basic structure, agriculture production, and the social organization of the village in Shimla. In the bigger picture, trying to understand the nature of accumulation of capital by the agribusinesses firm, particularly by Adani in the Apple sector. But here I'm trying to understand what has been the trajectory of self-replicating inputs in the region, what role the state has played in facilitating or not facilitating the market-driven inputs, and what impact or what changes has led into the peasantry overall in general. So I will try to explain how the capital has penetrated the agrochemicals. In that, I particularly means the fertilizers, fungicides, pesticides, insecticides, particularly that, how it has penetrated and what are the changes that are taking place overall. I'll just quickly skim through the research design. I have taken 4 apple blocks of the region. They are divided on the base of altitude, land holdings, and these are basically the major apple belts of the region. And the method of data collection has been semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, and field observation. The data has been collected over a period of 6 months, where first set of data was collected for 2 months and then jotted everything down, and then again, just to get the entire story over the span of 6 months. This is the sample size of the villages, altitude, that's how it's been divided. And I'm just going to run down the sample size, everything, yeah. So data analysis has been simple, where theoretical sampling has been done till data saturation, and then it has been openly coded, and then that's how the data analysis has been performed. Just a brief literature that the state, this body, basically there are a lot of, there has been scholars that talk about the increased dependency of corporates, of farmers on corporates, that has divorced the farmers from their means of production, and it has ultimately led to the subordination of peasantry to the capital. And that's how we are also seeing with how these agribusinesses have gotten directly into the production process or indirectly. So the analytical framework, it's at a very nascent stage. I still need to, I think, work more on it. It's basically the primitive accumulation sets the stage for surplus capital, and the capital, since it cannot directly penetrate, it takes an off-farm road, and it creates basically a vacuum. That generates a need to expand the means of production, and it constantly creates the demand for new raw materials to produce goods, which is now being added as a use value. So what the state has also, it has removed barriers. It has created additional avenues for the private capital to smoothly enter by limiting access to the farmers, and also raising the cost of their inputs. So that's how I'm going to explain in the later slides. That's how, so yeah, I have traced the penetration of capital since the 1960s, and I'm going to decade-wide explain what were the major changes that were taking place since the 1960s. So as I said, that the agriculture production was at a very primitive stage in the 1960s. Even though apple was fairly enough spread to the areas of around the Kodgar region, which was the Nankari block, and the Madog region. It is one of the Madog is one of the richest. It is said to be the richest apple belt in the region, and it spread somewhere around the late 60s, and people were still using their own organic manure, their self-produced kenchua khad or their own self-made fungicides or insecticides that they were using. This could probably be because the family size at that point was fairly large, so animal husbandry could be practiced comfortably, and also there were huge pastures of land. The land was not that much fragmented, and there was also enough grazing grounds, so that's why animal husbandry could be maintained. It was somewhere around the 70s that it was also in consonance with the Green Revolution that the fertilizers were sort of pumped into the system. The fertilizers was not it was not sort of introduced with the idea of using it in apples. It was initially used because it was never tested on apples. It was actually pumped into the system for vegetable to boost vegetable production. But slowly what happened that it became a norm to use fertilizers in the apple crop as well. So there were four basic sort of fertilizers that were introduced in the 1970s, and they were introduced in the granular form. Now this becomes important in the latest slide, I'll explain. But that's the major development of the 70s, that the fertilizers have officially been introduced and farmers started to use somewhere in the 70s. It was only now the red line and it demarcates a wedge. I'll explain this. In the 1980s, what happened is because of the application of fertilizers in the 80s, till the 80s, particularly in the year of 83 and 84, there was a complete impact on the apple production because there were now introduction of new diseases that the farmer could not combat with their own self-made insecticide or pesticides. And in the 83 and 84 region, Morog Nankri region experienced a complete downfall in their apple production. And this was the major region for the state to which compelled them to introduce insecticides and pesticides to combat those sort of pests that failed the crops in the decade of the 80s, in the early 80s. And it's very interesting to see that there has been no additional introduction of fertilizers. The fertilizers has remained constant since the 1970s. The same fertilizers are still being used by the farmers. But now, because of there has been additional use of macronutrients, micronutrients, plant growth hormones that are used instead of that are being named instead of fertilizers, which is so basically because it was said that the unscientific use of the fertilizers that took place in the decade of the 70s and 80s, it introduced the diseases into the system, and because of which we see that the private companies started to enter the market, and we started to sort of propagate the idea of macronutrients as balanced ratios, because it was said that what was introduced earlier by the government was not in appropriate ratios, and farmers had been using it unscientifically, and that is why there were a lot of diseases that took place. So this is a new era of macro and micronutrients. Initially, it was macronutrients where it was made available in both granular and as liquid forms, and they were introduced. Because it was said that it would have earlier absorption and earlier harvest, and this is why sort of this advent of macronutrients started to come up. It was nobody now, and it's a trend that has also been seen in the region where the fertilizers in general, the use of fertilizers, traditional fertilizers, has declined, and the new era of micronutrients have been adopted by the farmers. And these are completely supplied by the private sort of companies, particularly Yara in the region. And same is the case with the micronutrients. Micronutrients started from somewhere around the late 2010s, where it was said that these were advocated as all-in-one micronutrients by the private companies. So what I'm trying to say here is that so what we see is that over the years after 2015, there has been a slow monopoly of these private companies over the prices and the quantity. So the quantity over the years have reduced. For instance, a 50 kg bag has now been reduced to a 25 kg bag. And over the years, the prices have tremendously doubled, and there has been no sort of regulation on this. So, and since the farmers experience the problems like like thickening, like for instance, root nodules. Because of using traditional fertilizers, they have to most of the farmers are compelled to use these micro and micronutrients, especially by these companies. Um, Not only this, there has been a change in the self-replicating tools over time. For instance, like I said, initially people used to use organic manure, but over the years, because the structure of the family has declined, and the more the people have migrated towards the cities, the family sizes have shrunk. This is why there has been a decline in the organic manure, and this has created for a demand for the government, for the people as well. They want, so the government, what has done is that they have initiated Gautsudan initiative, which is basically procuring cow dung from the neighboring regions. And since the government stock also comes in a in a limited stock, so most of the farmers are connected to brokers, and these brokers, they have their own monopoly over the charges that um, they charge to the farmers, and the quality has also been questioned of these organic manure. Similarly, bee population has declined, worms has declined, and all of these self-replicating goods that were natural in existence have now been commodified. We can see that, and there is a huge price that is being added to this, that is already being added to the means of production. So slowly and gradually, the additional means of production has become more complex for the farmers. Very interesting case. What has happened that initially farmers used to, in the earlier times, the farmers used to have their own nurseries through which they used to make their own saplings out of the seedlings. But since there is now, and the old orchards used to last for at least 60 years. But what has happened over the years is that the new varieties are now being made out of rootstocks, which means the roots, it is made in laboratories. And even the method of cultivation has changed. So what has happened here is that even the lifespan has reduced to 10 years. So now farmers have, firstly, they cannot grow their own, they cannot make their own saplings anymore. They have to rely on these M9. And for these saplings, they have to rely on additional brokers that they have to source from. So these brokers and the prices that the government charges for these saplings are also very different. It ranges from 100 to 200, whereas the brokers charges someone 800 to 900. So there is no regulation over this complexity that is taking place. I talk about the shifting role of the state that has taken place over the years. So it has changed in four. It has taken place in four regions. The first is that there is a reduction of subsidies overall in the last 5 years for the farmers. There is a complete removal of stocks that were there. For instance, insecticides are not available at all in the government hemp pads. There is also very strategic lack of unavailability of fertilizers during the peak period. For instance, the potash has to be applied somewhere around December, but somewhere around the December, the stock is always missing. And the fourth is that there is also a price increase of general subsidies as well. So So if there is 500 rupees potash, it has now been increased to 800 rupees. So that's how the state has now acted it has sort of taken a backseat, and it has facilitated the smooth entry of private capital into the markets. All of this has created a vacuum through which the middleman has come to rise, and it is also coming from the farmers itself. So the local farmers who have access to the means of resources, and they are acting now as middlemen at various stages. These growers have access. They have access to water, technology, labor, etc. And growers are now becoming more heterogeneous in their approach, because only those people are able to grow rootstocks or access to those resources who have bare lands to experiment on their lands. So the cost of uprooting is way too much. There needs a lot of knowledge and investments for this. And there needs to be constant investments on these new varieties as well. So particularly when we talk about new varieties, So there is a separate class of, there is a complete division that can be seen in terms of the farmers, those who can produce and those who are not able to produce because of these reasons, and there is a complete disadvantage for them. Right, and in the recent years, we see that there is a new era of plant hormones. Very interesting. It has come in the recent 2 years, where PGR, known as plant growth hormones, has been introduced, and it's basically used for coloring and ripening the fruit. Because in Indian agriculture markets, the redder the apple is, the more it fetches prices. So now the farmers have to focus on making the fruit more red in color, and it has to appear in a certain way to be able to sell it. So what these plant growth hormones have done is that if one is applied, it is actually decreases the shelf life. So another one is used to prevent the shelf life, to prevent the fruit dropping. So to combat the negative effects of one hormone, another one is introduced. So that's how complicated the system has become. That it's not only changing the self-replicating goods, it's not only adding to the penetration of capital, it's already complexing the entire system of these for the farmers. And yeah, that's how they are consolidating capital. The self-replicating goods are creating an impact on the trees, and of course, it's in the longer run, it's impacting the tree health as well, and it's creating creating a market to counteract, like I said, it's creating a market to counteract the negative impact of the initial one. So there are two sort of plant hormones that are being introduced, which are again adding to their means of production. So it's creating a differentiation in the peasantry as well. How the capital is getting penetrated deeper by these sort of means is very, very sort of interesting to see. Right. So in all what conclusion that I have driven for this particular chapter is that firstly there is a class that is emerging from the local winners and losers. The local winners are those class of peasantry that has access to resources, that has also been historically advantaged, and they're also acting as rent givers or as middlemen. And secondly, there are losers are those farmers who are already facing diminishing returns, and they're continuously, the dependency cycle is getting more consolidated for them, because now what is arising is that not only they have to they have to focus on the production of apples, they also have to save their existing trees, because the orchard health is impacting every single year. It's getting more intensified. So that's the kind of stress and the loop that the farmers are getting into. The state has completely shifted its role from providing a support to full detachment from it. And that's how state intervention has sort of impacted. And these agrochemicals industries, they are not only sort of penetrating directly through it, but they're also giving rise to middlemen as well, that are arising from the same set of sort of farmers, which are further differentiating and making them more heterogeneous in nature. So that is what the initial conclusion is. And yeah, thank you. I think that's it. I hope that I was able to explain it roughly.
Yes, you were. That was very interesting. Thank you very much, Anchal. When we think about corporate agriculture, we often think about contract agriculture, and we're led to think about the indirect control of land and also the way in which corporates control agriculture through product markets. But you've shown us how they can control agriculture through input markets. Thank you very much. I want to call on Taniya Sah from Vidyashilp University in Bangalore for her reactions and her discussant's comments. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Barbara. Hi, Anchal. Thank you so much for this very wonderful, very well-researched presentation on such a critical and timely topic. I have also done my PhD on the stone fruits, basically peaches, and the agricultural markets for peaches in Uttarakhand. So your topic is very, very close to my heart and my research area. My comments are mostly like a lot of questions which are related to the broader picture, and also some some of the capital accumulation things that you highlighted in your presentation. So I would first of all start by asking Anchal whether, so a lot of my understanding of the cultivation of apples in Himachal also comes from my time as a researcher when I was doing my survey on the cultivation of peaches in Uttarakhand. So from my understanding and the interviews that I conducted with the farmers in Uttarakhand, I had a very different perception that the farmers in Uttarakhand would always say that we do not get a lot of subsidies and other kinds of benefits from the government of Uttarakhand. But if you go to Himachal Pradesh, the picture is exactly the opposite. The farmers there are getting a lot of subsidies, be it in terms of the inputs or be it in terms of marketing the produce. But your presentation also tells a very, the second side of the entire story. So my first question is that there has been a recent initiative. It's called the One District One Project, ODOP initiative, One District One Product initiative that was actually launched by the central government of India somewhere around 2018. And the idea was that the state governments across India were to identify one agricultural product from every district that had the potential of providing employment, generating income, and also the export potential from that particular district. So I wanted to ask, and I think for Shimla, probably apple or some other horticultural commodity has been identified as the ODOP product. So the idea with this ODOP initiative is that the government will provide timely inputs, be it fertilizers, be it the packaging inputs, etc., and also help with credit and the marketing provisions. So did you encounter any of the farmers in your interviews who mentioned this ODOP initiative, and what exactly, if you could shed some light on what exactly is happening regarding this ODOP initiative, if you have any information on that. So, that is my first comment. My other comment is related to the agri-chemical houses and the agri-business houses that you talked about in your presentation. So a lot of literature in economics and policy suggests that although these agribusiness houses, there is clear evidence that farmers who deal with agribusiness houses, they witness a rise in their incomes, but also these agribusiness companies are also biased in terms of selecting the farmers, and the bias comes basically from two factors. One is the geography, that is the location where these farmers are based out of. So basically those farmers which are closer to the markets, so the agribusiness companies would have an inclination to enter into contracts with these farmers. And the second bias would come from the fact that these companies only prefer initially to deal with the larger farmers, the ones who can give them a higher output of a better quality. So as a result of that, a lot of literature in India and abroad suggests that smaller farmers are not always at the gaining end, even if agribusiness companies proliferate in an area. So regarding that, what was your experience? These agri-chemical companies that you're talking about, are they also providing their inputs at a subsidized price to the farmers from, let's say, some remote areas, or some the marginal farmers, the small farmers who you have in your sample? So what the scenario is like in that particular context.
Right.
So, okay, so those were two things. Yes, apart from that, I would also like to know that how have farmers adapted, whether they have adapted to, or have they tried to resist these kind of changes, particularly the farmers from the lower socioeconomic strata of the society. And have there been any grassroots organizations, movements, or cooperatives which have come into being to counterbalance this increasing corporate power in the apple growing sector? That's one thing. And then Okay, so one of my last no, actually, this would be my second last question. I wanted to know what is, because you did not talk a lot about the sample strategy. I mean, you skimmed through it, which is perfectly fine. But I just wanted to know that, is your sample representative in terms of the caste of the farmers? Because I think the first slide of your presentation did talk about there being a hierarchy and there being the upper caste farmers who are basically the Brahmins and the Rajputs, and then the lower caste people. I mean, were there people from the lower caste community also who have orchards and who were a part of your sample with whom, I mean, you got an opportunity to have a discussion with? And finally, my last comment is related to the presence of women farmers in your sample. So, talking from my fieldwork experience in Uttarakhand, what I noticed was that this process of feminization of agriculture that we're talking about a lot of late, that because in the hilly areas, people do not really have a lot of employment opportunities. So the male working population has been migrating to, let's say, the plain areas or maybe to the cities, as a result of which the women members of the households are the ones who now have to take care of the farmlands. And it might happen that the men of the households, they come back during the harvesting season because it might be difficult for the women to deal with the intermediaries, the big farmers or these agribusiness companies. But apart from that harvesting season, the entire agriculture, like all the agricultural operations are taken control of by the women. So did you happen to notice any such like feminization of agriculture, as I said, in the context of apple cultivation in Uttarakhand? And one last question before I end this is whether you noticed any kind of diversification of occupations happening, like let's say the farmers from the larger sample who have access to capital and who now are also acting as intermediaries between these agribusiness and these agrochemical chemical companies and the small farmers. So how are they investing their profits? Are they reinvesting those profits in the apple industry itself, or are they diversifying? Are there younger generations diversifying into alternate occupations? Like there has been a proliferation of construction and service sector in the hill states of Uttarakhand and Himachal. So was that something that you witnessed during your fieldwork? So these were my questions, but overall, I think yours was a brilliant presentation and the fieldwork that you've done is absolutely amazing. So all the best, and I look forward to reading your papers in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
I'll answer everything one by one, if that's okay, and I'll also ask some clarifying questions from your questions as well, right? The first questions you asked is that the agrochemicals industry, they increase incomes, but they are biased in general in selecting their farmers, right? So did I notice that the large farmers are at the gaining end or not? So it's very interesting that especially the Adani company that is dealing with Morog in the Morog region, it primarily deals with small farmers because the larger the farmers are, the more diverse their crops are. So so the larger the farmers are, the more possibility of having all the grades of fruits there. But the smaller the farmer is, the maximum chances are that the farmers will produce a similar grade of fruit. And once you are in contract with them, which is not an official contract, by the way, they signed like an unofficial thing, and then they mostly sign with the small farmers. Larger farmers are very less. Maybe like in Morog region, I was able to find 2 or 3 at maximum who had 20 bigas of land. But the most farmers were around 4 to 5 bigas of land who were dealing with Adani farmers. So that was the first, I think, I hope that I was able to answer the first question. The second one was how the farmers have adopted or resisted change and what were the grassroots movements. So the thing is that there hasn't been any change as such. The smaller farmers are getting deeper into the cycle of expropriation, to be honest. I think the small farmers who have very like 2 to 3 bigas of land, they also do manual labor. So the labor is also very diversified in the region. The low caste groups, they perform manual labor for the apple, for instance, grading and packing, pruning. But their sort of labor is more skilled as compared to Nepali labor in the region. So the region, there has most of the farmers, they have now, small farmers especially, who are not able to produce apples enough, they are shifted to grading and packing and specialization of labor like pruning and grafting and pruning, these kind of labors, these kind of activities. So that's what the observation was. Was I able to answer, ma'am?
Yes. Yeah.
The sample strategy has also been right, like you said. Yes, I have the low caste communities have also been represented in the region. That is how I was able to understand how this labor system was actually working in the community. So the sample strategy does take into account the small, large, medium, and small farmers, and also the caste-based sort of organization. When it comes to feminization of agriculture, it's very interesting that I did not encounter a lot of female orchardists. There were only 3 in my sample size. And very interestingly is that because the bargaining power of women is less in the market, they do not understand a lot of how, especially not at the stage of producing, but at the stage of selling. So they lose a lot of bargaining power during the time of selling, because dealing with the mandis is a completely different ball game for the women agriculture. So what they prefer is that the thekedars, the local contractors, they come to the orchard and then they sort of sell the produce to them in bulk, and usually that's usually at a very discounted sort of, they are at a very at the losing end usually, but that's how they prefer, instead of actually going to the mandis and selling it. So feminization, I haven't witnessed, like there are a lot of women, not labor, but women farmers in general, who have taken over the apple industry in general, because it's a very complicated industry. So that is what I feel that I haven't encountered. Maybe that's one thing. And right, then you mentioned that has been any diversification of agriculture, or young generation have moved to something else. So yes, a lot of people are actually reinvesting in agriculture. For instance, there was seen that in Kodkhai and in Anchal region, a lot of young farmers have got into dehydrating machines, and they are directly sort of dehydrating the fruit, apple fruit, and other stone fruits as well, and directly sort of connecting to the consumers. So that's also how reinvestment in the farming is taking place again. So that's one thing. And diversification of agriculture. In some of the orchards, I did find that there were also diversification in terms of like persimmons and cherries that farmers are getting, because apple industry, because of the APMC and the agriculture marketing is very complex in the region. A lot of farmers are delving into other fruits as well, but it's at a very primitive stage. I haven't encountered the Progressive Farmers Association, which is found here. It's very common. These are the farmers that procure these M9 and these high varieties from Italy and other regions. These are the farmers who are indulging into these other sort of varieties of fruits that are diversifying their agriculture, but none other than that. So that was. I hope that those were the questions, more or less, and I hope that I was able to answer most of them.
And I think in answering that, you have also generated other questions. Now, in the Q&A, it's not in the chat, it's in the Q&A. There are questions from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, some of which, if you can hear a noise behind me, it's agriculture, heavy agriculture in France, grinding past my house. What I want to do is to put questions about production together, questions about marketing together, and there's a question about state and about policy and what is to be done. And Sudhir, you've asked several questions, but I'm going to put one of them with other questions. So please bear with me. So Katie is asking a question upstream of agriculture, to do with corporate capital and its role in linking different kinds of research and development to increase the market dependence of producers. His experiences with tomatoes and grapes in Nasik. And he's asking whether the seed research is actually formally linked to the research in agrochemicals in order to increase yields, but also we can ask whether they increase market dependence. Somebody called Anon is also asking a question which has implications for the way in which corporates actually plan and manage extension, manage the transformation of production. He draws attention, or she, to the diversity of input practices which are necessary for different varieties of apple production. In other words, as time goes on and as commodification gets more and more complex, the practices needed to maximize yields become more and more micro-precise. How does the corporate sector manage to persuade producers about these practices? And the third production question is very interesting from Rajesh. And at first sight, it's not a production question because he draws attention to retail demand in Shimla and in other places in other parts of India, and asks a very interesting question about how that demand is planned, or whether it is planned, and what is the role of changing demand for apples on changing supplies and production. Okay, so 3 questions to start off with from the audience, which have implications for production.
Thank you, Professor. So if I'm understanding correctly, the first question says that how the corporate capital is impacting the seed research. I'm sorry if that was the correct question, and how the seed research is increasing the yield.
How it's linked to agrochemicals.
Yeah, okay, how it is linked to agrochemicals.
Yes.
So what my understanding was that the seedlings and the rootstocks, they are completely different methods of raising apple crops. Seedling was prepared from seed, and the rootstocks are prepared in lab through the roots, basically. That's how the sapling is generated. So the new crops, the seedlings, so the rootstocks, they require more inputs. They're also very since they are also they have more they have less foliage. They're also shorter in height, stature, and they can be planted more closely. They're also very sensitive. They're also not drought resistant like the earlier orchards were, and they're also sensitive. They also require irrigation. They require more sort of inputs. For instance, they require more macro and it's said that more macro and micro inputs are required for them to produce enough inputs, because the smaller the tree also means the lesser the production per unit. So hence there is more pumping of inputs in the rootstocks. That's what I was able to observe. Second, I hope that I was able to answer that with some justice. The second question, I think, was I able to, ma'am? I'll explain again if that's not the.
No, please go on.
All right.
Please continue.
All right. The second question, which was how these diversity of input practice, they're also micro precise, and they also need to basically there is also a need to upgrade. Basically, that's what I was trying to say. How this is process is very natural also in some sense. I hope that that's what the question is trying to say, that since the commodification process, no, all right. Since the process of commodification is
how is it brought to?
Yes, ma'am, just one more, like once more. I hope that you're able to repeat so that I'm able to gather the question.
The second question was about the increasing micro precision of inputs for different varieties of apples. So it's not natural. And how does the corporate sector actually persuade producers of these micro precise practices?
So there hasn't been any persuasion as general, because these products are marketed as something which is already comes in balanced ratios. So initially, the fertilizers and other inputs that used to come through him pads, that used to be marketed as something which was they didn't require a balance, they did not come in a balanced ratio. But these products, for instance, Yara micronutrients and micronutrients, they're already marketed as all in one and in a balanced ratio. So that is why there is no strategy as such. But these are all for marketing these, but they already are marketed as a all-in-one sort of balanced ratio nutrients, micronutrients or inputs. So that's how the farmers use them. And last question was, how was the changing demand for apples supply and production? I am not sure if I have the correct, if I'm at a stage where I'm able to answer this question currently. So I don't think I will be able to answer this question. I'm not at that stage yet.
Well, it's the exact opposite side of the value chain, if you like, from inputs. It's right at the other end, but maybe that's for later research. Somebody else, also under the name Anonymous, has asked a question which is also to do with production. So I'm going to interleave it now, about the differentiation of the peasantry. And I want to add my own doubt about whether these people are peasants at all. So firstly, how are you defining peasants? Especially during the presentation, you said they were divorced from the means of production increasingly. Are they subsistence? Clearly not, because they've stopped producing food. Their existence is completely determined by capitalist markets. But anyway, so one question from me and from Anon is your value, the value you attribute to the concept of peasant. But Anon is asking other questions about the property relations of apple production in the region. And you skated over how you chose your sample. But I think it's very interesting, and do tell us more, because there will be many other questions about class differentiation, which requires us as the audience to know more about farm sizes and distribution. And Anon is particularly asking how that distribution of land has changed since the introduction of apples, which is a huge question.
Right. So the distribution of the land has been very interesting in the region, especially in one of the belts where a lot of the farmers who were initially not having any agricultural land, they were given land under the landless scheme by the Himachal government somewhere around the 1960s. And in the Chopal region, they usually those farmers who've gotten land due to the landless scheme, they've gotten land which is inferior, which is more rocky in the region. So producing apple for them has already become a very difficult avenue altogether. The region generally in apple distribution, and it's very different in other regions. For instance, in Morog region, because of the virtue of having more kiars, which is naturally water drained. Those areas are more in one of the blocks. It's also very shady. The quality of the apples are very different, and that's also a region which is particularly Deha and Morog are isolated from the state. So there is a lot of encroachment on the forests in that region. So a lot of people have converted their a lot of people which have converted the forest region into their sort of apple belt. So that's one thing that I found, and these are mostly the upper castes region. Like for instance, they have had maximum of upper castes farmers, so as Madog. So agriculture production was very different from Chapal and Nankari. Chapal and Nankari, these both blocks had very small farmers. And here also the differentiation between the farmers isn't much as compared to these two blocks, where which is also particularly isolated from the rest of the region. And also by the virtue of physiographic conditions, the state of apple is at a much, there are more large farmers there, and which is not because of the land that they had, but the mostly encroachment that has taken place in the natural forests. So that is one sort of thing that I noticed in terms of land distribution. The second thing in terms of peasantry, I think using the term differentiation of peasantry is at a very nascent stage would not be deemed correct from my side. But what I was trying to say that there has been a wedge, there has been a divide between the large farmers or not even large, particularly who have access to means of resources, and those who are sort of getting more consolidated in this dependency loop by the agrochemicals industry, or in general by contracts by Adanis, etc. So that is one thing that I would like to say, that maybe this terminology might not be correct on my. I would rather, because peasantry in general is a very complex term, so this might not be correct. So I would just like to clarify that. Right. I hope that those were the questions that
Yeah.
we'll to address.
Yes. Thank you very much. And thanks for being honest about the need to rethink in some respects. And I'm sure people can share literature that will fast track that process of rethinking. Before I go to Sudhir's questions about state and policy, I want to, sorry, I've got another lorry. I want to summarize Kunal's questions, Kunal Munjal, who's also studying marketing, agricultural marketing.
Right.
The first question is about the dynamics of corporates, and that also has a bearing on state-capital relations as well, but the extent to which corporate inputs, research and development is actually planned to increase technical efficiency rather than dependence on the corporates. Can you distinguish the two? And the second is about the nature of capital. And there's more than one question, I think, from the audience about that. And putting it very simply, what proportion of the inputs markets is now dominated by the corporate sector? And what proportion is still controlled by local merchants' capital or local agri-business? And Sudhir has asked a question here about Mr. Adani's activities in the product market and the extent to which Adani is linked to the input market as well. So 3 questions about structure and behavior of the corporate sector.
Right. I think the first question is very interesting, that how do I separate technical efficiency from the nature, the penetration of capital in general. It's one reason is because the technical efficiency is such that these chemicals that are being penetrated, they're creating a division in the peasantry first. Sorry, they're creating a division in the farmers. Let's say that because those farmers who are especially very well versed with sort of this input markets, they are able to they're very efficiently being able to use these inputs. But what is happening here is that, so there is sort of for instance, plant growth hormones, that are PGR, that are recently being introduced in the last 2 to 3 years. That is being, for instance, to combat the negative effects of one input. The other input is introduced. What one input is doing is that it's it's maturing the fruit earlier, and it's causing fruit dropping. To combat that, another input is being introduced to combat that earlier leaf falling, earlier fruit falling. So that is how I feel that that's the differentiation between that's the difference between the technical efficiency and how it's sort of it's the penetration and capital getting more complex. That's how I view it. I would further need to analyze the data more to be able to speak it with a lot of confidence. The second is that what percentage of input markets is dominated by the local agribusiness. I do not have data on that or the analysis of that yet. So I don't think I'll be able to answer the second question. I'm really sorry. And the Adani activities, well, in the region, they are just they just procure the raw materials. They just procure the final product, which is the fruit. and they provide subsidies on the anti-hail nets to the farmers, which is basically the hail nets that they introduce farmers during the period of March to protect from hailstorms. That is the only the area where they are actively sort of participating. But other than that, there are other private companies that are involved in agri industries or agrochemical sector. So I hope that was.
And can I just clarify that in your sampling design, one of the reasons why you can't answer the question how important the corporate sector is in relation to the non-corporate sector is that you haven't yet or at all studied the non-corporate sector. Right. But there is a non-corporate sector for inputs.
I haven't studied that yet.
No, but the key thing is that you know it exists. Yes?
The non-corporate sector.
Yes.
For instance, like the inputs that the farmers get from the government. Is that the question?
It is that there is a market which is in some senses segmented between the corporate sector, which you're studying, and something else, be it the state or be it local. I think the interest is in whether there are local merchants, local businesses involved that have been shoved out of the market by corporates. I think that's lying behind the interest of the question. And what you're saying is that you don't know the answer quantitatively, but in saying that, is it correct that there are other distribution channels than the corporate sector?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are other channels as well.
Now we come to Sudhir's questions, which are a little bit more normative and historical and more general, but thank you very much for them. One is that, are you arguing that the formula, the technical formula for the Green Revolution failed in Himachal? The formula of seeds, fertilizers, pesticides doesn't work in Himachal. And related to that is the question, is the corporate sector to blame for that? And the third point that Sudhir makes right at the top of the chat is, can you actually assess the impact of corporate inputs on farm incomes? Or was that not a question you thought you could ask or answer? And the fourth question is, what do you think the alternative might be to what you're observing?
Well, the first question, where if the Green Revolution has failed in Himachal or not, and the seeds and fertilizer doesn't work in Himachal, that is not true. I don't think that the entire formula has not worked, because it was only after the 60s 70s that the boost in apple sector has grown so much in the region, and the production has continuously increased. More farmers, maximum number of farmers now, they produce apples as the mainstay of their livelihood or their income. So in general, the apple sector is very beneficial, and the Green Revolution has definitely worked in favor for the farmers. Initially, the farmers also who are not trained in in terms of how to use the fertilizers or nothing. That has become more specialized over the years. So not saying that it has not worked for sure. I don't think that I can assess the incomes through farm sector. That was the second question, I think. I don't think that I have yet done that. This is just my second chapter's preliminary analysis. It has to get more refined as I get more feedback. So, but I will look into it. I think that's a very interesting sort of way to get more deeper into the question. And the last one is what the alternative might be. It's very difficult to say right now what the alternative might be. There are people in the villages who have started to shift to organic. The problem is with organic is that it's going to take a lot of time to boost production. And so a lot of organic farmers here they have completely said no to chemical fertilizers. In fact, they make their own fertilizers by decomposing and composting, etc. methods. But that has taken them over 6 to 7 years to get into a stage where they can now have enough production. So that is going to take a lot of time. So I don't think I'm in a position to say that I have an alternative right now.
What
But
about co-ops? China,
cooperatives,
100 years ago, was talking about co-ops for at least small farmers.
I'm not sure if co-ops work in the. Actually, there's also a sort of, because there is a lot of competition among the farmers as well. So a lot of farmers are very secretive, like they don't tell the kind of products they use and what inputs they use. So there's a lot of harmony. It does look like there's harmony, but there's a lot of secrecy that also goes behind sort of what products they use or what inputs they use and how they market it, etc. So I have not come across any co-ops. I'm not sure if that it could work, but I haven't encountered any. Interesting, there was no farmer organization also present in any of the blogs that I saw. Only the progressive farmer organization of the big capitalist farmers who procure M9 and M12 from other cities, countries. Just that.
Thank you. Arushi asked the question about sample.
Yes.
By all means.
Oh, sorry, no.
Back to Arushi later.
I have to go. I just wanted to now that because you mentioned cooperatives, it may be interesting, contrasting experience of a country where not burdened by the same sort of social institutions that Himachal and indeed India in general are. Some years ago, that's now almost 20 years ago, I went with a team to Shanxi, which is in China. They were implementing then a program of stabilize and increase grain production, increase fruit production, and animal husbandry. And as part of that, they tested what are the requirements of apples of a successful apple growing regime, and they came up with 10 criteria. Shanxi fulfilled all 10, and within a decade, they put their minds to it too. Within a decade, Shanxi was producing 8 to 10% of the world's apples, and they had a side thing in kiwi fruit, and they were producing about 20% of the world's kiwi fruit. And what they were concentrating on was after that, post-harvest development, and supply chain development, and manipulating varieties for increasing shelf life. Now, obviously, this has been a huge success because there's not a place in India, even the smallest town, where you can't find apples from Shanxi on the shelves. So I mean, it's a different story altogether, and one that I found at the time interesting. Of course, as I said, it's many years ago, but even our notebooks, Barbara would raise the average age around this in this forum. But that's it may be of some interest to those who are interested in apple growing and how a society unburdened by the rotten institutions of Indian society actually can go ahead and with apple production. Sorry, that's all I have to say, and I'm sorry.
I saw this.
Sorry for the interruption.
I saw this myself in October last year, and what amazed me was, yes, organic apple production, yes, vast market share, but covered in plastic, as in France around me, and controlled by precision irrigation, which requires metal tubes and computers and water, and actually a dependence on materials and energy, which in this part of the world may come from fossil fuel, which when we think of organic production, we don't actually factor in. So in the investment goods, and one of the things that Anchal is looking at is the commodification of investment goods, like covers, tillers, what else? Precision irrigation. That isn't organic at all. That's highly materials and energy intensive. Okay, so there is this question about sampling. There's one in the chat. Okay, thank you. Let's go back to the question on sampling. How did you sample? I would also like to repeat Arushi's curiosity about sampling, because it is the basis of your analysis, and it is the basis of the general statements that you're able to make. And of course, technically, when the sampling fraction varies, which it does in your villages, I think, although that's another question, how did you decide the sample size inside your villages? It does compromise what generalizations we can make, especially when we don't know the relationship between the sample and the total population. So it's a very good question. So how did you find your sample?
The sampling has been was done in stages. The first was to pick out the major apple belts in the region. There were 4 in Shimla district. Marog, Deha, Nankuri, and Chapal. These are the 4 apple growing belts in the region. Second level was to understand the low, medium in terms of the altitude, because the altitude changes, the cropping pattern changes, and the number of varieties, etc., also changes. So that was done on the second level, and the third level was done at the village level, where the population, where I'll just open the slide, where it has done in terms of the population of the villages. So Nankari block, in terms of the population, was somewhere around 11,000 something, and that's how the number of villages were selected, and for the and that's how it was demarcated. And small and medium, I'm not able to explain it correctly right now, but that's the process that went behind it. I'll just open the slide. Yeah, so the land holding was also taken into account. So it was done in first the largest apple belt, the altitude, the large, medium, and small farmers, they were demarcated, and then the land holdings according to them, and then the villages. So that's how the sampling sizes went. The sampling was done at the village level, and the unit of analysis also at the village level. So that's how the sampling was done. I still need to make it more, I think, explain it in a more concise manner, but that's I don't have a lot of information on sampling right now. It's I need to look into it in more detail, I think. So,
Please do, because the way you sample also affects something else that's coming out of your research, which is inter-village variations. I've just examined Deepa Kurup's thesis on employment guarantee schemes, which includes a very imaginative methodology for inter-village comparisons, and we can share that, I think. Thank you. Friends in the foundation, do we have a few more minutes? Can we have 2 or 3 more minutes before winding up?
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor. We can.
Great, because I think that exhausts the 11 questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much for everybody who asked those very interesting questions. And I really have 2 more to add, if that's all right. Taniya, would you like to add any more questions?
No, Professor.
Okay, so I would just briefly like to add 2 observations. I've got many more, but 2 for now. The analytical frame that you're using is the penetration of capital, and along with that, the process of differentiation. And many scholars of Indian countryside looking at these very rapid changes would also add primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession, whichever you prefer, alongside the process of differentiation. But the other body of theory, which is very interesting, is commodification. And the thing about commodification is that there isn't a natural break. And as Polanyi said, once you have generalized market society, you have a contradiction in terms, society falls apart. So there are all kinds of interesting questions to do with what is breaking, what is putting constraints on this process of commodification, because maybe it doesn't have a break naturally in the process of commodification, but it's not necessarily without a state or without society. And what you've shown in this presentation is very fascinating, that even manure, even the old organic practices were commodified. And then we have chemical fertilizers. And what you've shown is that fertilizers are in the plural, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then other fertilizers. And agrochemicals is also in the plural. And we get to fungicides after pesticides, insecticides. Yes? So each of these is complex. And then you turn to investment goods, as I mentioned before, tillers, covers, drip irrigation, this kind of thing. And then as you were talking, you talked about the commodification of organic, neo-organic practices. And then we go on to this extraordinary replacement of long-lasting apple trees by quick, very rapid, less high-yielding, but denser, I presume, new varieties of apples. So the whole idea of an apple tree is revolutionized. And finally, micronutrients and then hormones. And never let us forget that at the same time, food is being commodified, because as you explained, when apples started to be produced, food production went down. So population is growing. So food is coming in from somewhere else. So food is also being commodified. Now, the reason for this long list is to do with K.N. Raj. K.N. Raj wrote a book in 1985 on commercialization, or edited one. And his centenary is being celebrated next month in CDS Trivandrum. And if you read the introduction to the 1985 book on commercialization of Indian agriculture, you find several things which are really interesting and stand the test of time. One is his preoccupation with the commodification of land. But the other is that, in his view, commodification can take many different institutional forms. In other words, the commodification of land will involve one set of institutions and social relations, but inputs, as you've just explained in fine-grained detail, may involve a whole set of different relations, yes, and practices, which affect the outcomes on people's farms. So K.N. Raj was saying, yes, it becomes complexified over time, and that's what you're showing. But it becomes complexified in different institutional ways. And that's what I think your data may be able to show. Or if it doesn't, it's a two-way win. If it doesn't, you can also comment on this hypothesis of K.N. Raj from the 1980s, which I think is still relevant. Oh, and I didn't mention the proliferation of brokers either. Okay, so that's the first point, that it's not really a question, it's a point about what you're describing, that it may take a vast range of institutional forms. And they don't go away if we ignore them, if we try to use terms which are broader brush. These micro institutions actually affect outcomes on farms, as well as inside the post-harvest system. The second set of comments builds on Kunal Munjal's comments about this new scale of capital that's coming in quite fast. You talk of them as social outsiders. They're obviously economic outsiders. There's a scale which is incommensurate with the scale of capital that's generated locally in the local region. And my reaction, having studied capitalism in Arunachal, is that this is quite common in mountain regions, that the transformation is being pushed by capital from outside. So then there's a very interesting set of questions about where does that capital come from, which you're beginning to answer, but also where do the profits go? And that requires a different kind of, it requires looking at balance sheets and company reports. What is being done with the capital that's pushing this transformation? Because it's almost certainly not being reinvested inside Himachal. And so that has a bearing on what you conclude, that this system involves expropriation. And I'm very intrigued by this. It's a physical expropriation of nutrients from the soil in the form of apples. and increasingly commodified inputs to try to make them the right standard size. And it's economic expropriation as well as physical, metabolic expropriation. And so in order to, and you do allude to extractive capital, and I'm pretty sure you're on the right track, but if it's a doctoral project, you need some supportive information, which you don't yet have. Some of that can come from company reports, but others will affect your research design and the question about sampling as well. Because if you want to make a conclusion about exploitation through non-labor markets or expropriation or extraction, it will be very useful to have at least indicative costs and returns, model costs and returns, or profiles of costs and returns throughout your differentiated production system and also throughout the post-harvest system, which then loops back to the question on what on earth else is going on in the inputs market, so over and above the corporate sector. So those were, well, there's some of my comments. I got a lot more, but I hope they're helpful.
Thank you.
I don't know
Yes,
if you want to respond now.
I think the comments are very useful. The analysis that I have done is at a very nascent stage. It needs to develop more. So these comments are definitely helpful, and I need to look at my design as well to see how I can accommodate the comments as well and make it more make analysis more deeper. Right now it's at a preliminary stage, so I need to make it more. Thank you so much. These were really useful comments, Professor.
It's not for me to thank you, it's for the foundation to thank you, but I do want to thank you. And I want to thank Taniya also for very well organized, good discussants, comments. And also to mention to the audience that, that we will meet in a month on October the 25th, and we will carry this conversation forward into future markets and their failure in the cardamom sector with Tony Kurian from IIT Bombay. But anyway, so this is in a sense to be continued in the next round of the season of seminars. So thank you all very much, and back to the Foundation for Agrarian Studies.
Thank you, Professor. I'll just take a couple of minutes to propose the vote of thanks. I would like to thank Anchal for this informative presentation. I hope the discussion was as enriching for her as it was for us. We are grateful to today's discussant, Dr. Taniya Sah, for her participation and valuable comments. We are also very grateful to Professor Barbara Harris-White for chairing this session and her continued support in expanding the scope of this series. I'm thankful to the online team at FAS, Sandeepan, Tapas, Setu, for their role in conducting this seminar very smoothly. We thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their generous support in making this series possible. Last but not the least, we are grateful to all the attendees for participating and making this a lively discussion. As mentioned, this session will be made available on YouTube in the near future. To know more about the foundation and the work we do, please visit our website fas.org.in. We are on social media. You can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I request that you follow us on these platforms to not just get updates about this seminar series, but also about our other work. Our next seminar is titled Crashed Futures, Sociological Investigations into the Failure of Cardamom Future Markets. As Professor Barbara mentioned, it will be presented by Tony Kurian on October 25th, 2024. We'll be ending the session with this. Once again, thank you all very much for your continuous participation throughout the series.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you all.